Hey friends, I have good news and bad news today. The really bad news, and I literally have a tear in my eye right now, is that Mia is sick and she is not going to be with us today for this episode. The good news is today our guest is someone who is equally, maybe more passionate and can nerd out with me on family history stuff. So I'm so excited to introduce him to you. But I want us all collectively together to think of a question. How many generations ago did your ancestors start speaking a different language than you are speaking right now? Or another way to phrase that would be, how many ancestral languages have you lost? I think this is such an interesting question. And so I'm going to go ahead, while you're thinking out there, I'm going to go ahead and answer this for myself. My first language is English, American English, since there's lots of forms of English. And so I speak Mexican Spanish because there's lots of different kinds of Spanish as well. But my Spanish isn't perfect. It isn't the same as my first language, English. But if I'm looking at my Irish side, they spoke English, but also Gaelic. And then I have Swedish ancestry and Norwegian ancestry. I also have indigenous Mexican ancestry, which they spoke Nahuatl. Oh, Italian is another one. No one in my family speaks Italian anymore, even though I have a very Italian last name, Fransoni. There is a lot of language loss in my family. And if this is not something that you've ever really thought of, today we're going to get into it of how language loss might affect your family history story and maybe some ideas about what we can do about it. You're listening to the Love Your Lineage podcast by LDS Living, a multifaceted, shame-free approach to family history. I'm Michelle, and we want to help you find your space and claim your place in your family history story. So today I want to name this feeling that I often have felt during family history work that I've never had really a name for it. In Spanish, there's this saying, ni de aquí, ni de allá. And that means I'm not from here or from there. It's this feeling of rootlessness. It's this specific kind of grief that comes with not being connected to our roots, not being connected to our family history story. And I want to name that feeling today. If you've ever had that feeling, we're going to name it today so you know exactly what you're experiencing. It's called diaspora grief. And diaspora or diaspora, I'm not even sure how to say it, but it's the dispersion of any group of people from their original homeland. So anyone that's immigrated, been kicked out, had to flee, in the African diaspora, enslaved, stolen from their family, anyone that has had to leave their homeland and is living somewhere else right now. That's a lot of people. I think we hear when people immigrate from different places, they often say, oh, they sacrificed so much to come to this country. And we don't really talk about the specifics of what they sacrificed. And I think that's a big part of diaspora grief. But to talk about this more, I really want to introduce you to my friend, Professor Joel Selway. So Joel, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
I've been looking forward to it. So.
Yay. Okay. The one thing I love most about Professor Selway is that we met at his sister's birthday party. I could tell we had this kinship of understanding how important family history work is. Professor Selway, would you mind giving us a brief introduction of like who you are professionally and then maybe a little bit of your family history background?
I teach at Brigham Young University. I am an associate professor there. I've been there for 13 years. I teach classes on Southeast Asian politics. This semester, I'm teaching a class on the international relations of Asia. I also teach a British politics class as well. But those classes and my interest in those things professionally, I think stemmed from this feeling that you've described that I never had a name for either, that I had, I think, throughout my entire childhood. And then as I kind of entered adulthood, was something that I was really trying to, again, subconsciously tackle in some way. And the way that I did it was by going into the academia and learning about the history and the languages of Southeast Asia. It's just kind of like this melding of both personal interests and academic interests. It's kind of a real privilege to be able to do that in my career.
That is so cool. And I love how you have made this connection. Like what I do today, right now, is very much connected to my family history and this feeling of diaspora grief. And I think there are so many people out there who are feeling the same way, whether they've made that connection or not. So thank you so much for telling us about your professional bio, but could you tell us a little bit about your family history? And just to be transparent, I've heard a little bit of Joel's family history before, but it was so fascinating. So I'm really excited to learn more about your history. So if you could go ahead and share that with us.
I'm from England. I was born and raised in England, in the southeast of England. My mother was from Thailand. And, this is back in the 70s, 80s when I was growing up. And in our town that we grew up in, she was probably one of the few ethnic minorities in the town. And so we, as kind of biracial children, were quite visible in the town. And that was definitely part of our experience growing up. My mother used to speak Thai around the house, not to us. We never learnt Thai language. I think back then there was this kind of belief that children shouldn't learn more than one language. It might confuse them, might be bad for their development. Or it could have been a personal decision, I don't know. But regardless, we didn't grow up speaking that fluently with our mother. She would teach us basic things, numbers, basic introductions and things like that. But we had this fairly traumatic experience as children. My mother died when I was age 12. We were 7 siblings together, and the youngest was, I don't think she was even 1 yet, our youngest sister. It obviously left a hole in our family for numerous reasons. But in terms of this kind of connection to that side of our family, that culture, that was just kind of ripped away from us. All of her family lived in Thailand, and obviously this is pre-internet days, so I guess if there are young listeners listening to this, they may not appreciate this, but you can't just FaceTime them or messenger them on Facebook or anything like that. I don't think we even knew their address because my mother had done all of the communication, obviously, with her family. I'm not even sure how long it took my dad to write a letter to her family and let them know that my mum had passed away.
Wow. What were your thoughts about Thailand? You knew you weren't 100% British. With your mom gone, how did you feel about your identity?
I don't think I thought much about the implications of what it meant to be of a different identity or things like that. Every so often it would show up on the football pitch. I like to play football. I remember there was one team and I think I did a particularly strong tackle on this guy and he pushed me to the ground and he called me a racial slur. And I think it was one of the first times that, at least since my childhood, that I'd experienced that. So I kind of flipped in that moment. I don't know where that came from. And I think it was just a lot of things bottled up and that was subconscious. And there was something about the way that he treated me and the word that he used that just, And
I would say it hard being like a multiracial child, not having the parent of that other race to be there to help you process what just happened. Because having someone say something racist to you, it's a form of trauma. And just having your dad to process, he probably nothing like that's ever happened to him. So he was like, I don't know how to help you process this information. And
exactly.
That's a huge part of diaspora grief, is this feeling of disconnection and not having like someone to guide you on how to like process things that are happening in your life.
And, I think for various reasons, I think my dad's personality and maybe just English culture, he was quite distant from us. And so even at church, people would say, oh, who's your dad? And we would point out to our dad, this hazel-eyed, light-haired, blonde-haired when he was younger man. And people would just like laugh and say, nah, you're joking. That's not your dad. I think my mum was very excited and interested in living in England. She was a very internationalized child, as I've kind of learned as an adult growing up. And so for her, I think it was very exciting to live in England. And my dad had not really experienced Thai culture. He didn't speak it. And certainly I don't think he could appreciate a lot of the things that were happening to us. So there we were in this little town of Folkestone in southeast England, and kind of like the heart of our family had just been torn away. And so we had a number of traumatic years over the next few years, where we just have some very interesting stories about, my dad actually came over to America with the missionary who had baptized my mum, and I think he was trying to find a new wife. And so we actually all were split up and went to live with different people. And I can't even remember how long that was. I want to say it was a few months. I lived with one of my friends in the ward. And then my dad came back, announced he was getting married. We came over to America in 1990. It lasted 3 months.
Wow.
The marriage. We went back to England. We moved towns. A friend of my mother's who had lived in a different town where there was a church ward community with a larger kind of youth group said, I think it would be good for your children to move here. And again, there was some more physical separation of the family, of the siblings for a while. I won't go into the craziness of that period. But essentially, it was like a 2-year period where not only had our mother kind of been taken away, but all of our stability had been uprooted.
So when I say rootlessness, you're like, I know that word so intimately.
Yeah, I understand that. I have memories of walking the streets in the rain in England, feeling very disconnected from lots of things in life.
And were you still at that time very different than your peers? Like you looked multiracial. So
the town that we moved to, Crawley, it's right next to Gatwick Airport. It was a lot more racially diverse. I think I grew up the rest of my life in a very kind of English culture. I went to Church of England school. We grew up in council houses. So definitely lower class. And that was kind of part of my entire childhood experience and part of my identity. So I went to a school, and that was a place where I always felt like I could kind of escape these things because I was good at school. I wasn't necessarily particularly good at languages. I think my French teacher didn't like me. And I ended up getting a B in French. You could only get an A, B, C or thing. If you got a B, you could go on and take an A level. So you have GCSEs and A levels. And so I got a B, and then I went, because I thought at like age 16, this is the last 2 years of high school, I thought, I think I might actually be interested in languages. So I went there with my B, which I was kind of wanted to rub in her face because I knew she didn't like me. And she basically said, I'm not going to have you in my class. I was quite naughty in her class, to be quite fair.
Okay.
So I went on and I took business Spanish. There was a business Spanish course. So I took that. I took that for a year.
That sounds so boring.
Well, it was really just Spanish. I don't know why they called it business Spanish. But I think I was beginning to be interested in languages at that point. And, it was during that period of time where I really kind of grew to have religion be an important part of my life and to kind of feel the differences that could make in my life. And so I decided to go on a mission. And of course, I really hoped to go to Thailand on my mission. This is where I knew that I had started to become a nerd because I was working to save up for my mission. And, most English people at workplaces go down the pub and have lunch and things like that. And I obviously would do that every so often, but I found myself wanting to go down the library.
Yes.
So I used to go down the library maybe at least 3 out of the 5 working days and read up about different languages and cultures. And it obviously started off with Southeast Asia and things like that. And after a few months of that, I was like, I wonder if there's any books on Thai. I know you would think that might be one of the first things, but it wasn't. And so I had never really thought of learning Thai before at all. So I looked for books on learning Thai, and I found this old book. I don't know when it's published. It looked like it was from the 50s or 60s. It taught the language in a very old traditional way. But there was something about finding that book that, I don't know, it kind of sparked something that I had never felt before. And I thought, I wonder whether I can start learning this language. And then strategically, I was thinking, I wonder if I put down on my mission application papers that I had learned some Thai, could speak some Thai, whether that might increase my chances of going to Thailand. So they ended up sending me to Greece.
Of course. Obvious choice.
So this is back in 1996. I guess one of the reasons they probably sent me to Greece was they had a hard time sending American missionaries there for all sorts of visa problems. And there was a lot of anti-American sentiment. So it turns out that about 75% of my mission were Europeans. At first, when I got there, I was really annoyed because all of the Europeans could speak 2 or 3 languages fluently. So I had I had 2 Dutch companions in MTC. They're some of my best friends in the world now. But I remember just being so annoyed by them because they could speak Dutch and English.
And it just flowed.
Yeah, really well. And also German.
I also am annoyed with them.
Yeah, and then one of them could speak French. I was like, who do these people think they are? I'm going to learn Greek better than them.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit competitive. So I thought, okay, I've had a disadvantage here. I kind of speak bad French, a little bit of Spanish, but I'm going to learn Greek and be the best at this. And I studied really hard throughout my entire mission. And I fell in love with the Greek language, the Greek people. I served half of my mission in Cyprus. And I remember near the end of our mission, we did this testimony meeting on Mars Hill. And the mission president said, I want everybody to give their testimony in their native languages. And this was actually one of these identity crises points for me. Because I was like, well, yeah, I'm English and I love England. And that's probably my go-to identity in general, right? That's where my culture is, all of my sensibilities, my language.
The way you speak.
Yeah.
Yes.
There was something about the way he phrased that I was like, no, I'm not going to give my testimony in English. So I gave it in Greek instead. Greek had become part of my identity in some way. Maybe lots of other missionaries feel this, but it was kind of like there was something beneath the surface there that was like, So it started to be more of a kind of an emotional feeling, if that makes sense. And there were some other things on my mission that happened that kind of reinforced those. So when I was living in Cyprus, and of course I grew up in England where the sun never shines. So my skin was fairly pale. But when I lived in Cyprus and you're out every day on the streets, I just got really dark, like really dark. And I remember we went to a British base there because there's a couple of British bases on the island of Cyprus just to go get some fish and chips. And my companion was this 6-foot-something Swedish guy with blonde hair and blue eyes. And I remember, thinking, this feels very familiar to me, right? This looks like a fish and chip shop. This looks like a British army base. I grew up near a British army base in Folkestone. But then they would kind of like turn away and talk to my Swedish companion. I was like, and so you start having these feelings like, what is that about?
Which I just want to validate. Like I experienced that as a missionary too. Yeah.
And I was like, And this was the first time where I had a conscious thought where I was like, they're not regarding me as fully English here, right? Or maybe not even English at all. That was another kind of strange event for me that happened.
I'm more of a countryman to you. I am British and he's Swedish, but yet you were talking to him as if he's more of your countryman than I am. And what's happening?
Exactly. And so, that was probably more maybe the demographic of people that were in the town that I first grew up in. Whereas for most of my teenage life, I was closer to London. And so we have more of this kind of multiracial London identity, right? And way of seeing our British identity, right? And it still involves all of the quirky parts of Englishness like Doctor Who and just a quirky sense of humor and all of those things. But there I was on this British outpost on Cyprus and I started feeling invisible, maybe that's the best way to describe it. Then when I got back off my mission, I think all of this began to surface and I was like, I really want to reconnect with my Thai side. So here I am, age 21, and I thought to myself, you know what? That dusty old book that I found in a library before my mission, where it seemed incomprehensible and totally unachievable.
And maybe like super intimidating.
Yeah, really intimidating. I was like, you know what? I can learn a language fluently now.
I can do this.
I can do this. And so I went and picked up another book from the library. Maybe it was the same book, who knows? We decided as siblings that we were all going to go on a holiday to Thailand.
Oh, man.
We had never been there before. I mean, I had been there when I was 3 years old. So we'd never been there since that time.
So you felt your diaspora grief as individuals. Like it wasn't really like a collective, which I think is really common for people who are wanting to engage in family history work. Maybe other people in their family are not interested, or they're the only ones that feel the fire or feel the spark. But that's so cool that individually kind of all were feeling it. And then you decided, let's go to Thailand.
That's right. Yeah. And we never had a conversation about it, but we're like, we're no longer teenage kids stuck in a council estate, right? We have some means now.
Mm-hmm.
And
did you have any connection to your aunties and uncles, or did you know their names?
We knew their names, remembered them from growing up, but we had no connection with them for the entire time since my mum died.
I just want to set that up, like it wasn't like easy.
No. But we went there, we flew over there, and I think because we were poor, we just got the cheapest flight possible. And again, this is pre-internet days.
Mm-hmm.
I think we found this flight, you had to like look up the number of some shady travel agent, and Uzbekistan Airlines, which
You're
was,
like, who knows?
Yeah, I didn't even know where Uzbekistan was, but we got on this airline.
Awesome.
It routed through Uzbekistan, Tashkent, which had this very interesting airport, which actually looked like it was very Soviet style. And concrete walls looked like there were bullet holes riddled throughout the whole floor. One tiny little shop to buy things from.
Whew.
But we went through there and we got to Thailand. We were able to all go as siblings. And I think maybe we stayed a month there, something like that.
Wow.
You know, we have longer holidays in Europe. So.
Yes.
And, you know, we got off the plane. We didn't have a hotel. Because again, no internet.
I love this image of you siblings all together, just like showing up in Thailand and be like, okay, now what? Like,
yeah, I mean,
this is awesome.
I thought, you know, I know how to handle myself in a different country.
Mm-hmm.
I've done this in Greece. So I was like, we'll get there. We'll find a hotel,
mm-hmm.
right? So I think we somehow got down to the center of Bangkok, and literally me and one of my brothers just started going into different hotels and asking them how much it was and negotiating with them.
In English or in Thai?
Yeah, in English.
Okay.
It was in English. Yeah. And again, this was all very new to us.
Yeah.
And it was also, there was a financial crisis in 98 in Thailand. So the price of hotels had dropped significantly and the value of the pound was strong. So we were able to get, you know, really good deals and in probably a nicer place than we had ever stayed in our entire life. And there we were, kind of like hunkered down in the middle of Bangkok, doing some touristy things, right?
And can I ask you, when you got to Thailand, did you immediately feel like, oh, these people look like me, or were you still like not from here or from there?
We felt like foreigners. We felt like tourists. But you know, there was a time, I think my brother had set up a time for us to go visit our aunt. And my granddad was still alive then.
Wow.
I think he was in his 90s. So I think we went there and we had some type of dinner there, met a couple of our cousins.
What did that feel like? This is family, but not family? Like,
yeah, it did. It felt exactly like that. And again, it was great, right? You know, talking to the cousins my age. But then they also lived in a very nice place, in a very nice house. And again, I think some of us were thinking, what happened to us? Like, we got disconnected, not just in terms of communication, but there's a clear disconnect here between the lifestyle that all of that side of the family are clearly living in Thailand. I mean, they lived in this gated community in a very nice big house. And we lived in council housing over in England. And it wasn't just that we didn't look like them and couldn't speak Thai, but for us and meeting this family, it was like, whoa, we're a completely different social class here. Like, I don't even know how to act in this setting, right?
I grew up, you know, living under the poverty level, raised by a single mom. And then when I went to Mexico, I mean, they lived in gated communities, had maids.
Yeah, they had maids, right? Yes.
My uncle was a doctor, and so they had like access to a private plane and would like fly to Canada to go skiing. And I was just like, what? Like, this is so... So I can totally understand what you're explaining here. So
there was that, but then there was also something just like a little bit, I don't know, restricted about the interaction. Like, especially with one of my aunts.
Like guarded.
Yeah, my aunt was very guarded. don't want to get
And so
into
you
all
probably
of
have
that.
like questions like, who was my mother? Like,
Yeah.
because this is different than.
This is different. And so, we knew some of the stories. We knew that my grandfather had been in the Thai Foreign Service and had been stationed around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And we had some pictures of our mum, or at least some memory of some pictures of our mum, or some stories that she had once crashed her dad's Mercedes-Benz when she was a teenager or something like this. But that was just a story. It wasn't anything palpable that we could really understand. But here we are in this house having this very kind of, it's almost like formal, like introduction to the family.
And I think this is very common for people when they reach out to distant family members or even close family members that there's been this separation. Very much we want it to be like, oh, they met us with open arms and hugged us and welcomed us as if we were theirs, and they're guarded. It feels a little awkward. It's uncomfortable.
Yeah. With that particular aunt, very guarded. And she actually is kind of like a very successful and high up person. She has worked in the Department of Agriculture, but worked very closely with the Queen of Thailand. I think she helped coordinate the Queen's annual flower show or something like that. And now she has some special appointment, I want to say, in some type of royally related foundation.
Wow.
So that's her background. And then here we come, her sister's children out the blue. And we're very rough around the edges, right? We don't understand any of the customs or norms of Thailand. My mum always spoke very highly of that aunt, but I've never been able to make a connection with her. To this day, it's still very guarded. But with my other aunt, who had kind of actually given up the whole almost like aristocratic upper middle class life and moved out to the border near Burma, partially for health reasons. She said Bangkok was too polluted, but I think partially to get away from some of these family dynamics, which I still don't fully understand. When we eventually met her, she was more of the type welcome us with open arms. She said, I've had dreams that I'm supposed to look after you guys. She invited us out to her house out in the country, and it was like this place with no air conditioning and just mosquito nets and things like that. But, you could definitely feel the love that she had. And so I have a very close relationship with that aunt.
How did you feel in that environment where you were welcomed?
I mean, she was just very lovely from the beginning.
And did you feel like a sense of this is part of who I am?
Yes. Yeah, for the first time. And I think especially for me and my siblings, and this is more an experience I've had coming to America, actually, because in England, there's actually very few kind of people of East Asian origin. There's mostly South Asian, right? Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi. But I don't look East Asian, right? That's also being kind of a part of, just thinking, what am I? Because I don't even know what I look like, right?
And even when I go to Mexico, depending on where I am, I still look like a tourist.
Right.
Even though.
Interesting. But yeah, that interaction, it was a foreign feeling, but it was like, yeah, I do have a place here. And I think that gave me a little bit of encouragement to pursue a path, right? And it was a very organic path. It's not like I sat down and here's my 20-year plan to get to where I am. It was bit by bit, realizing I can, being interested in this and that. So I came back from Thailand and I thought, I really want to learn Thai, seriously now. And so I began looking at university programs where I could learn Thai. There was one in London called SOAS, and then BYU actually taught Thai as well.
Wow.
I ended up coming to BYU. In the kind of the 6 months after we came back from Thailand and before I came out to BYU, again, partly because we had made some of these family connections in Thailand, we realized that one of my mum's cousins was posted in a foreign service in London. And so we went out to meet him and his wife was just really nice. I would go up there maybe every other week and she would kind of give me little Thai lessons.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not trying to make tons of practice. It was more the connection that was meaningful to me.
And I think when I'm hearing you tell the story, you're just kind of going through the motions. But me as an outsider listening to this, I'm like, the braveness, the vulnerability to just be I'm going to try to learn a new language. I think a lot of people might be feeling fear. And I think it's so cool how you're I'm just going to take it bit by bit and see where it leads me. And I'm doing this and I'm asking for help.
Yeah, and so I learnt Thai for that time. I got to BYU, and for some reason they weren't offering first-year Thai classes, just second year. That was kind of strange. But because I had kind of done enough from that dusty old book and with my aunt, I jumped kind of like straight into that second-year Thai.
And was it really hard? Because from what I know about Thai, which is very little, it's a completely different alphabet.
Right.
There's no spacing in between the written language. So what?
That's right.
How did you?
Yeah. So the Thai alphabet is technically phonetic. It has 44 consonants,
Oh dear.
33 vowels. Some of the consonants just repeat each other. So like there's like 4 T's or something like that and 3 S's. And you got to learn which one you use when for different words.
I just think of myself and so many other people be like, this is too hard. I can't do this.
Yeah, it was.
What did you say to yourself when you're like, this is really difficult?
I guess maybe this is where I have a little bit of pride because I was like, well, there are some returned missionaries over there in this class. And if they can do it, I can do it.
This is my birthright.
Yeah.
I love that.
I did very well in the class because I can study what's given before me and then I can ace everything, right? So I did that. I aced all of that stuff. But then in the third year class, when you have returned missionaries starting to join you.
Who lived in the culture with the people, listened.
Yeah, and they can speak it fluently. And I'm still speaking it like a robot, still trying to piece together the flow, never having really lived there. So yeah, I could ace every test and beat everyone in the class on the tests, but I couldn't sit down and have a conversation. And that felt really embarrassing because I was
and painful.
Thai. And painful, yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people realize, or even return missionaries, that for us, where this is our heritage, this is our family history, and we've been disconnected from the language, and then people who have no connection to it are learning this language fluently. They're learning songs or folk stories or whatever, and they come back and they're like, oh, it's a shame you don't speak Spanish. Oh, it's a shame. And it's like, you have no idea how painful it is that you can speak my ancestral language, that you can connect to my heritage in a way that I cannot. I would have given anything to be able to be in that culture and listening to the sound of people talking at a restaurant or whatever, and to gain that sort of language learning. But that was something because of my family history and the separation from my roots and my culture that I never got. And so I wish more people understood that part. So thank you for touching on that topic.
Even today, it causes me so much pain every time I go back to Thailand because nobody assumes that I'm Thai. At the very best, once they get into a conversation with me and they're like, actually, your Thai's pretty good. I'm still very conscious of my Thai and the fact that I know I don't sound like a native. But they're like, oh, well, then you must be half Thai because nobody else learns Thai to this degree, right? And then they look at me, they're like, yeah, we can kind of see that you're half Thai. But just the average interaction I have on the street, right, is...
Ni de aquí, ni de allá. Like, oh.
Right. So something else at BYU, I took an Asian studies minor. And they had nothing on Southeast Asia. It was all East Asian. I grew to have a real love for Japanese literature and culture and fascinated by that. But every paper I wrote for every one of those classes, I asked the teacher, can I write something on Thailand? And they said, sure. So I would go off and go research that. As part of my PhD, I went and took a bunch of classes on that, and I continued taking Thai. So I chose the University of Michigan because it has strengths in Southeast Asia, has a very good Southeast Asia program, and it had Thai language there. So I continued learning Thai. After I had done the 4th year of Thai, I did just basically one-on-one classes with the teacher there. But then I also took all of these classes on the history of Southeast Asia, and that has turned out to be, I think, a real benefit in doing family history. And this doesn't click until much later in the story.
But I love that you're bringing this up. Knowing the general history of a place, even if you don't know specifics, is so helpful.
And I think everybody can go and do that, right?
Yes, especially with the internet. Now that we Google it,
I eventually get back to Thailand in 2006. So this is like 8 years after I first go back with my siblings. And now I've taken, 5-6 years of Thai. I'm actually going back there to an advanced study of Thai program. It's an intensive 2-month program up in the north of Thailand.
Were you scared at all? Or were you like, yes, I have prepared for this, I'm doing it? Or were you like, oh man, what did I get myself into?
I mean, both. Because, you know, there's only, 15 people on the program, and they're all from these big universities. And so again, it's like, I'm the one with Thai ancestry here.
Okay, so these weren't other people with Thai ancestry. These were...
Yeah, I don't think there was a single person. There was like, there was a Laotian person and then like a Chinese American, but then the rest were kind of like European American.
Okay.
So I go through these 2 months, and at the end of the 2 months, it's my first time I've had this like intensive in-country experience. I don't even feel I'm as fluent as some returned missionaries, but I feel for the first time that I've got this down. I mean, it's been a lot of years' work, right?
You can move through the spaces naturally within the communities.
That's right. And most importantly, I could read Thai, and I could read newspapers and books and things like this. And so my vocabulary, especially non-religious vocabulary, is much higher than my Greek non-religious vocabulary. But yeah, it's more just about, for the first time, I feel like I can express myself. I can understand most of conversations, and I'm feeling like I can kind of fit in.
You can enjoy the music. You can understand the joke, or maybe even tell a joke.
Yeah.
That's huge.
It is huge. So right on the back of that, as I'm finishing that program, I get informed that I have a Fulbright scholarship, and then I'm going to get to spend the whole academic year in Thailand.
I want to cry right now.
Yeah.
Like, that is so awesome.
And it was just like, I can't even explain it. It was just, I think the ability to go to Thailand for a year was way better than the prestige of getting the scholarship. I'm like, if 2 months can give me that, I've now got a whole year ahead of me.
Beautiful gift. During that moment, what were your thoughts about your mother? Did you feel like she was...
that's a tough
proud
question.
of you, or happy that you did this reconnection? Or
I think probably for a lot of these years, I think I just pushed all of those feelings underneath. I certainly feel a connection with her now that I know her story, can kind of like track her different movements throughout life, where she was, have had conversations with her cousins, with her sister, and can kind of put some color into that. Like, what was her personality like? And why was she doing this over here and different things like that? One of the things that I found out while living in Thailand, and obviously, you go to some Thai restaurants and you eat Thai food, but you are never ready for the full color of Thai food unless you live there. It's so amazingly flavorful. There's just so much more than
layers of flavor.
And there's so much more than just pad Thai and curries, right? Which is what a lot of Thai American restaurants serve. I mean, you get into the depth of Thai cuisine, and it's just this amazing experience. And then it just clicked. I was like, my mum ate this food growing up.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, at some point, she moved over to England, and she never ate that food. My mum, at every dinner, had this little bottle of chili powder, and she would like sprinkle that on top of her food to give it flavor. And
as a kid, you're just like, that's just something my mom does. But
exactly, I never really understood it. And then all of a sudden, I'm eating this Thai food, and there's a lot of hot flavors in there. And that memory just came. I was like, oh, that's why she did it. And yeah, I just had all of these thoughts as a parent, because I was a parent by that point, thinking, I wonder what she was thinking, the fact that she could never feed us any of that food and that we never got to experience that stuff. Because food is such a social thing, right? You share it. I share it with my kids now. So I have learned to cook Thai food and I share it with my sister. That's one of our favorite experiences, actually, with my sister.
To connect to your culture. And just to point out, that is family history work, connection through food and culinary experiences and culinary practices. That is family history work. It's so fun and awesome and delicious. I love that part.
So I finish off my Fulbright, I finish off my PhD, I come out to BYU, I'm teaching at BYU. And again, you kind of get busy with life, right? And then I think maybe it was in 3rd or 4th grade, my daughter, my oldest, had some genealogy project. She came to me and she was like, can you tell me about my grandparents or great-grandparents? I can't remember what she was. And I was like, for all of these years that I've been studying Thai language and history and things like that, it was like, I think I had forgotten why I had done it in the first place. And now I couldn't even answer some very basic questions in a 4th grade ancestry project. I was just kind of embarrassed for myself. Like, I didn't start all of this just to write a book, an academic book on Thailand. I started this to reconnect with my Thai side, with my mum. And here I am, 15, 20 years later or something like that. I actually don't know any of these things.
History stories.
I can even answer some basic questions about my mum, right? And that's when the journey began. I want to say it was like 2010, something like that. So we're talking about the last decade or so. And now I was like, okay, I felt like Liam Neeson. I have a very specific set of skills.
I love this.
And I'm like, I'm going to use these skills now.
I'm going to do something about this.
To do my family history. And I'm going to do it in a very serious way.
In a way that only a passionate history nerd can do.
Yeah.
So when you got this spark of like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do my family history work. Were you thinking more traditional, like I'm going to get names, go to the temple, which I mean is awesome. Or were you more like, I want the stories. I want the whole view, the 360 view, or what were you thinking?
It was definitely both. I at once felt some type of, I don't know, do you want to call it Mormon guilt?
Yeah,
That
is a very normal thing that many LDS people can connect to, if the feeling the guilt that we haven't done the work. Yes.
And I was like, I've spent a good decade or so doing this, and yet I haven't got any additional names, except I know the names of my grandparents, not even sure how to spell them in Thai, which is kind of a strange thing, right? But then at the same time, because a lot of the questions in my daughter's project were asking for stories and things like that, and I didn't know any stories. And then that's when you kind of have this adult thing like, I don't think I ever knew my mom. I had a lot of emotion during this period of time.
Yes.
Like, I haven't passed on any stories to my children about my mom.
Is it too late?
Yeah, is it too late? Like, I reached out to my dad. I was like, did my mom do any family history work ever? And he had some papers. This is my dad. My dad, he's not a hoarder, but he keeps papers.
Yes.
This is his one of his strengths.
That generation.
Yeah. So he has lots of papers. And so he went through papers and found some things written in Thai that looked like it was like a family history branch or something. And so he sent me these papers and I looked at them and I was like, yeah, this looks like some generations, and it goes back a few generations.
Was it in your mom's handwriting?
Yeah, it's in my mom's handwriting.
Awesome.
Handwritten Thai is very difficult, especially if it's like cursive Thai.
See, once again, I think many people would walk right up to this line that you're at in the story and just be like, this is too hard. I can't do this. And I'm just like, what made you think you could do this? Or were you just so excited or maybe
I was
driven?
so excited to have that little list of names. And it was just like one direct line or something like that. And then I think on my grandmother's side, there was a little bit of a branch. I actually go and visit that aunt. Remember the guarded aunt? I took this list with me. I'm like, do you know anything about this family history? And she said, I remember your mum asking about this. And so she wrote me a letter. I went and asked around the family. And I'm the one who sent her this little lineage chart or something like that. And she said, I remember speaking to the family member who had this information. We descend on my granddad's line from an ethnic Mon ancestor. And so again, it's just a piece of information where I'm like, that's really interesting.
The clue.
It's a clue, right? So the Mon were the ethnic group that lived throughout Thailand and Burma before the Thais and the Burmese kind of came down. They were the primary group there, along with the Khmer, the Cambodians.
So they're like the indigenous people of that area. Okay.
Built these huge civilizations. And then the Thais came down and basically took over, and they were kind of pushed over to the side. And then she said something like, I think there's like a family temple in Ayutthaya, which was the old capital of Bangkok. And she said,
gosh, I'm so excited.
Yeah, she said, I think it was called Wat Garong, which is the temple of squawking crows.
Okay.
So I'm like, I got to go to the temple of squawking crows.
You have to. You've got to.
Yeah, which sounds like it should be in like some martial arts movie. Yes. And I should end up fighting somebody there.
Maybe you will. We don't know. Okay, keep going.
So I went there, and it was kind of a strange temple. And I was hoping to find maybe some places where my ancestors were buried or something like that. I spoke to the monk there. And there was nothing there. So I came away really disappointed.
Super bummed. Oh.
Yeah. So I was like, okay, I've got to do this more systematically. I've got some names there. And one of the things that I started to notice in the names were that there were some titles in the names. It's from some type of peerage system, very similar to kind of like the English peerage system. So I guess if you make it high up in some bureaucratic position, you can be given some type of lifetime peerage title. Yeah, like a lord, different things like that. So then I began doing research on the different ranks and what those were. And then I found out like one of them like had a really high rank. That was like, this was the oldest one on the list. That was like a Viscount, I think you pronounce it. But then, so I knew something about this from having done professional research that once you kind of tap into those types of things, there's probably written records on them somewhere. So that's when I begin kind of trying to search for these things in the archives.
Do you have to be like a special professor to access those archives, or can anyone walk in? Like, how did you know what to do?
I'm not sure. I don't know if anybody could walk in, but I certainly
but you walked in.
I walked in and then they're like, you're a professor from this university, just fill out this form. So yeah, and that's just totally overwhelming because I don't even know where to look. And so I didn't find anything.
Yeah, what can you describe when you walk, what does this place look like? What are you seeing? Yeah,
you're seeing a desk and you have to ask for things. I think there's a computer. You have to know what you're looking for. I was just so overwhelmed that
was it just like shelves of
you can't see the shelves because they're back
there
and wherever they store them to keep them safe. And so I didn't spend very long there before I left.
Because you're like
almost running away, like I have no idea what to do. So that kind of avenue stopped for a little while. And I thought, okay, well, here's something else I can do. I'm just going to go and speak to every single family member that's living and ask them for as much information as I can. So actually the next few years, next maybe 2 or 3 years, was me taking oral histories. Okay. So I spoke to all of my mum's cousins. So she grew up with these cousins in the same kind of family
complex. Were you ever turned away?
The guarded aunt, I don't think we've ever got into any stories about my mum. And then there's a couple of her cousins that were just not interested at all. But lots of them actually were.
Awesome.
And they gave me stories. I found out stories like one of them said, oh, did you know your mum was a really naughty teenager? Like, really rebellious. And then he was like, then I went over to visit her in England. Like she had married your dad. She had a couple of children. She was like a changed person. And he was like, I didn't believe that this could happen.
I love it.
And so I had all of these like little stories here. And then I began asking stories about my grandparents and then my great-grandparents. And then just collecting as much information as possible. And then eventually everybody said, oh, you've got to speak to this one cousin. And he's actually now moved to America. He lives.
There's always that one person. And he was in America the whole time?
He was in America. He had gone there to study at Berkeley, maybe study at Berkeley, but he lived in Berkeley.
Okay.
So I had a conference out there at Berkeley. So I decided to go to contact him and meet up with him. And he was actually named after my great-grandfather. And I'm like, everybody says I've got to talk to you. And he was like, oh, I think what they're talking about is the fact that I think he was maybe the youngest, but he was very close to my great-grandmother. But also he was the type of personality that had constantly asked my great-grandmother stories about her life.
And was he so excited that you wanted to know this information?
Yeah, he was like, finally somebody who's as nerdy as me. He's like, oh, by the way, I've got all of these photos that I've taken. He just gave me a whole file of things.
I'm freaking out.
But it was the stories that I was most interested in. And so he began telling me stories about my great-grandmother. You got to think these people were born in the late 1800s. And so this is where my historical context comes in. Because during the late 1800s, Thailand had just kind of like staved off colonialism. They were never colonized. But they were trying to mimic Western countries. And so all of the elite and the kings were like, let's create these Western institutions. Let's create a university. So in 1890, my great-grandmother's born. My great-grandfather's maybe born like 10 years before her, like 1880. But so my great-grandfather went into a military career and he was in the king's bodyguard corps or something like this. So he wasn't like a personal bodyguard of the king, but he did protect the royal family and he had interactions with princes and things like this.
Wow.
He was kind of in this elite circle. My great-grandmother was in this elite circle. And this uncle told me stories and said, yeah, she used to go over to the royal household. And the royal households are big during this period of time because they had multiple wives. But she was very famous for having cooking Vietnamese pancakes. That's what she went over. They loved the fact that she cooked those things.
And just while you're saying this, I'm just seeing, like you're saying before, we were talking about feeling rootless. And while you're telling these stories, I'm just, as an artist, I'm like visualizing these roots coming down, just like coming down. Feeling connected. Oh my gosh. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, so the stories, they have so much power in, you know, maybe they're not so meaningful in and of themselves or objectively, but to me, you're right. They're just like drawing me in and
they turn the heart.
Yeah, they do turn the heart. So there they are in this circle, but my great-grandfather apparently has a really bad temper.
Okay.
And the story is that one day he goes off with one of the princes and like gets up in his face, threatens him. I don't know what happened. So this prince, whoever it was, and we don't know the name, but somehow orchestrated a move, a transfer for my great-grandfather up to the northeast. And during this period of time, the northeast is like complete backwaters, right? Wow. I mean, we're talking like no roads, no everything. Again, my uncle says they had to pack up a horse carriage and travel, you know, hundreds of miles. This was a punishment, right?
And it's him and his whole family.
Him and his whole family. So my great-grandma has to go there.
Yeah.
So here they are.
She's like, you idiot.
Associating with royals. And now all of a sudden they've been sent up there. And again, we don't know much about it, but I piece together the history because I'm nerdy. I'm like, I go look up the number of roads that are built there.
Yes.
You know, how hard that must have been. And so she gets there and he actually dies. I think he falls off a horse in an accident.
Oh my gosh.
So here's my great-grandmother left up in the north. She begins having to sell stuff just to make her way back to Bangkok. And then, of course, when she's back in Bangkok, she's kind of closed out of these elite circles. And she has to sell off so much of her stuff. She can basically see the writing on the wall. And she's like, okay, the one thing that I'm going to do to make ends meet or to kind of this completely new future is she's going to buy a state-of-the-art sewing machine. It's a Singer sewing machine. And somehow my uncle knew the exact model of the sewing machine.
Oh my gosh.
And he had a picture of it. It's one of the pictures he sent me. And he said, this isn't the picture of her sewing machine, but this is the exact model. It's like this really old-fashioned foot-pedaled sewing machine. So here we are in like the early 1900s, maybe the 1920s. And my great-grandmother, who's in the midst of this vast social change, has the forethought to say, I am going to send every single one of my children to university. I don't think there's even a university officially opened in Thailand at this period of time, or it's maybe just open, but it's not like a real university yet or something like that. But she's like, that's the future. I am going to like work as a seamstress.
And this is new technology.
This is new technology.
That she's never seen or done before.
It's manual labor. I'm not sure whether she had to do manual labor when she grew up. It seems like she grew up with
a lot of privilege.
A little bit more wealth and privilege. But she figures out if I do monk robes, I get more money. So she began to sew monk robes and sell those. And she had 4 of her own children and 4 children that were stepchildren from my great-grandfather who had been married before, and I think his first wife died. She got all 8 of them to university.
Oh my gosh.
And then she said, I'm going to look after all of your children. You go off and be as successful as you possibly can. This amazing woman like somehow has this foresight and works that hard. And like every single one of my grandmother's generation is like, you know, top in the bureaucracy. And yeah, so I have all of these amazing stories that I got just from these oral histories. And then another thing that I begin collecting that I realized that exists, that I never knew existed, is when people die, especially if they have a little bit of money, they produce basically like a memory book. They call it a funeral book that has some of their life history in. Oh my gosh,
I'm freaking out.
Some other things that are meaningful to them. And so I'm like, I never knew these existed. So I go.
Is this like a specific Thai thing?
Yeah, it's a specific Thai thing. Yeah. And so I go around trying to collect as many of these funeral books as possible. I have one for my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and then lots of other people in the family. I've just been collecting these as much as I can.
And were they like, did people not want to give them to you, or they were pretty?
I just don't think they realized that
they were special.
That I wanted one, yeah, or is it special? So I was like, no, I want every single one.
And were you freaking out? You were just like
Yes.
so excited.
Yeah. And they're all in Thai, so it's these Thai language resources. So this has been a big source of stories, right? In addition, so I've got oral histories. I've now got, at least for some of these ancestors, at least from my grandmother's generation, and then I've got one from my great-grandmother. I've got some actual things written down. And then I'm like, okay, so the last maybe 4 or 5 years, I've been trying to tackle the older ancestors. And I'm like, I want stories from them. I want to find out all about them. And so I begin just doing Google searches in Thai for all of these names. And then by this period of time, the National Archives now has like an online searchable website and stuff like that. So I stumble on this book. It's basically, what's the translation of it? Like
you can say the Thai word.
Yeah. So it would be like the word dragoon and then the surname. So it's kind of like the word dragoon means like your clan lineage or something like this, or family lineage. It's more like clan or something like that. So it would be like the history of the Selway clan, right? Okay. So then I found the history of this clan called Rojanawi Park clan. That clan book that I found had the history of the first ancestor that was on my mum's list from all of those years ago that my dad had given me. And then I begin translating this and I'm like, this story is amazing. So it turns out that that first ancestor who lived in the late 1700s, he was the chief of the elephant department, which was a government kind of formal government department, because elephants were used in warfare. It's like being chief of the cavalry department or something like that. He wasn't military per se. I don't know whether it was a military ministry, but he was actually in charge of finding elephants and training them. And then in Thai culture, the white elephant is very special. And so he went out and found this white elephant and brought it back. And then white elephants are given these special names. I
have like goosebumps.
Yeah, it was like, as I was translating, I was like, my goodness, like what is going on here? Yeah. And then he died in the attack of the Burmese on this city. Now, I know about this attack because this attack is the most infamous war in Siamese history, in Thai history, because it's the day that their old capital got burnt to the ground by their sworn enemy, the Burmese. And so it's this huge event in Thai history, this transformative event. And he was the chief of the elephant department when the Burmese attacked. So I don't know if he had military skills per se, but he did train elephants for military purposes. But I was like, he probably got on his elephant. Because it said that he died in this attack. But he probably got on his elephant while everybody waited for this huge Burmese army to come and basically burn down the city. So I have all of these like Lord of the Rings pictures on me, like, some of those battles where they're in that valley with that big wall and then like they're waiting. They were like, we're basically going to die. The orcs and the elves are going to get us. And I have this vision of this great-great-great-grandfather.
On an
elephant waiting for his impending death because they knew they were going to die. I actually began telling some of these stories. I was recently in Thailand with a bunch of political scientists from around Southeast Asia. And they were listening to all of these stories and they were like, Joel, you've got to write a book on this.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
They were like, because all of our histories on Thailand are about kings and things like this. And they were like, the fact that you have these stories are just like amazing.
Everyday people.
Yeah, everyday people that made Thailand. And so, again, he must have had some privilege to have made it to the top of the elephant department. But it's not like he was a royal or anything like that. But he has this just amazing story that he died for his country on this elephant, on this very special animal. So then the Rojanawi Pat clan name gets tied to this individual. And so we kind of have a family emblem, as it turns out, that has the elephant on it. It's like basically the emblem of the elephant department. So I get on this Facebook group, which has this picture up here. Then I begin just, because I'm a nerd, I begin like sending out lots of messages and like trying to get people to answer these things. And like, so is this our official family crest or anything like this? And then people get involved in this. They're like, yeah, we really want to know this. And other people are like, well, we don't really have family crests in Thailand, but we chose this because, this was the crest that was important to that family.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently his son also worked in that department.
Mm-hmm.
His son survived that attack. Of course, we had to come from somewhere.
Yes.
Was taken captive by the Burmese.
Oh my gosh.
Somehow later escaped, and then I guess continued the family line. But this book, this clan history, had those stories in there, and it was like they were just waiting for me to come and translate them. So I spent a lot of my spare time, my nerdy spare time.
Mm-hmm. And this is where family history, like people are like, oh, it's boring. Why should I do this? And, you know, we talked about that Mormon guilt. But like, once you realize what is possible, and this is what I always say, you need to be optimistic and unrealistic about what you can find in your family history, because you just never know what is there, and you never know what steps the Lord is going to give you to get to that point.
Yeah.
Your entire story, I feel like slowly, very slowly, you've been guided. You've been given these little teeny steps to get to where you are now, because it's something you desired. You wanted to heal that diaspora grief. You wanted to build a bridge. Yeah. And it's just incredible. And your sister, Celestia, you're my friend, so I'm just telling everyone publicly that we're friends. When I met her, how excited she was about what you have done and how much she valued the gift you have given their entire family to have these roots, this connection. And your story is so amazing and so beautiful and so exciting and thrilling. And I just hope everyone out there realizes that, like, Professor Selway's amazing, Joel's amazing, but like, I know from my own personal story of where if this is something that you want, the Lord will make a way for it to happen. It might not be a name or a date. Yeah. It might be a recipe. It might be something else.
Exactly. So along the way, before I got to, I mean, it sounds like amazing. And I'm sure there's probably some of the listeners out there who are thinking, well, that's never going to happen to me. I never had ancestors like that. But remember, I only really found that stuff out within the last 5 years. Yeah. People want to start out, I would certainly recommend getting oral history, sitting down, trying to hear as many stories as possible, because you'll be surprised at what random member of the family remembers this or that detail. So I think collecting those oral stories can be very important.
And even in your case, it wasn't like these were relatives you grew up with and it was so easy to just go over. You were cold contacting them, basically just like, hey, and yet for the most part, you were received really well.
Right.
And that's the same in mine. I was cold contacting a lot of these relatives through Facebook, through WhatsApp, and I thought they would reject me. They would say I'm crazy or think that I'm trying to trick them. And I've actually been received really well. So I'm like, give courage and hope to any of you out there who are like considering gathering these oral histories that you can do this. Yeah. You can do this.
You can do that. You can do you can look up standard histories, right? And so you can put things in context. So even if you only have a name, you can say, well, they must have lived during this period of time. And what must have that been like? There are no ancestors before 1770, but the record says we think that our ancestors came from this ethnic Mon migration. Not we think, but they come from this ethnic Mon migration a couple of hundred years earlier on. Now, I obviously don't have any names from that migration, but I can go to the history books and I can find out, oh, well, here are some names of the leaders that brought that Mon group over. And this is why they came over. And these were the circumstances. So I have no names from 200 years before that, but I still feel connected to that. And that's just from kind of like basic history you can get from history books, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't discount doing that history, oral histories. And like you said, even small things like a recipe. I don't think I had a real Thai meal growing up. And just thinking about, I wonder which foods my mum really liked. Obviously, she liked hot food, right? And so here are all of these recipes in Thailand that are hot. And then, it may not be true. It may be myth or fantasy, but you can picture your mum like eating these different dishes and
or your ancestors and like, maybe it's not the perfect, most exact thing, but it's like you are reaching out to them. And in my mind, they would reach back and be like, I see your attempt to connect and I'm here. Like, I love that so much. What's your mom's name? Can we say her name?
So her name is Savitri. In Thai, it's actually pronounced Sawitri, which is kind of funny because we just called her Savitri. But her name's Sawitri. It's actually a name that comes from Hindu, and there's an epic tale about Savitri. There are parts of that poem where I'm like, wow, that was a really well given name, right? You know, maybe not everybody's going to have an ancestor that has a name from a Hindu epic poem where you can do that. But these are some basic things that you can do, like, what does my mum's name mean and where does it come from? And writing some of those things down.
So, Joel, one question I want to ask, because in our podcast, we talk about genealogical consciousness and the connection of past, present, and future. And so all this work that you have done, how are you ensuring that these family stories, these deep, deep roots in Thailand are not lost to future generations? So like you growing up without knowing these stories, that never happens again, as much as you can control to future generations and your children.
So, I mean, I'm writing things down and recording them, right?
Okay.
So I'm translating these things. And again, this is kind of like the nerdy academic side of me, right? I'm trying to produce things that I can just pass on, so physical things. Part of it is also, I think, sharing it, right? And so, like you mentioned before, I share this with my sister and her children. Because I'm a professor, I create slideshows.
Yes.
And I go into the whole history and context of things, because I think that builds up to now you can understand fully.
It's like seeing a whole puzzle instead of just a small piece. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm very conscious of doing this, you know, I don't know, at least once a month, putting together something, telling my children about those things. So even some of my Thai cousins are like, oh, when you figure all of this out or, you know, like digitize it, like pass it on to me as well. Right?
Awesome.
Like, so I do think that, yeah, I would say to the one individual, right, who maybe feel like they're doing this alone, and especially at the beginning, it can feel very lonely, that some other people, members of your family who, for whatever reason, might not be able to do it to that extent, are definitely going to appreciate it and could be the ones that pass it on to the next generation.
How has finding this information, I don't want to say healed, because I think healing is a journey. So on your journey to healing, how has this work helped you? Like, why is this a commandment that we are supposed to turn our hearts to our family members?
Yeah. I mean, I always knew I was Thai.
Yeah.
But I had no connection to the language, to the culture, to any of the stories, to the food, to anything like that. So I always felt primarily English, and I still do feel primarily English. But there are now times and contexts, especially going back to Thailand, I think I care a little less about the fact that people don't see me as Thai per se, because now I know that I'm Thai, right? I have these connections with family members, right? And I know deep histories. And so it's kind of funny when and I do just like to talk to random people, especially to practice my Thai. This past summer, we went up to Ayutthaya and I found a temple that the ethnic Mons had built. They'd been given a space to build. And so some of my ancestors probably participated in building that temple. But then I was talking to the park attendants there and telling them, you know, my story. And they were just like fascinated by this story that I knew about that temple and its history and had ancestors there. And it's just random conversations like that where then you're like, yeah, I may not look Thai. My Thai may still not sound like native Thai. But if I can have a conversation like with a park attendant about my ancestors and tell them stuff they don't know, right?
Yeah.
Then I really feel kind of connected to that. I remember I went to this East Asian club at the University of Michigan. And like most people there just looked East Asian and they were like looking at me like, what is this guy doing here? And so in those kind of contexts, I feel a lot more kind of confident talking about my Thai ancestry and feeling like I'm just as Asian as you are. And I know all of this heritage and stories and things about it as well. So there's kind of been a confidence that has, like you said, helped with the healing and
a confidence, or even like this authenticity that no one can challenge that or take it away. When you are connected to your family history, the sense of being rooted, the sense of authenticity, no matter what anyone says to you,
that's right,
you are secure.
Yeah.
And it's so beautiful.
And I like that phrase about no one can take it away from you, because that was a feeling that I had before. Like, it had been taken away from me. And B, I think I felt like I had this imposter syndrome for many of the early years doing this. It's like, oh, well, you're not really Thai. What are you here doing in our country?
And you never will be enough.
Yeah. But now I do feel enough that it is my country. And so that is very healing, right? To be able to go there and feel like it's yours, at least in part.
In your opinion, in your experience, why is family history work a commandment? Why is it one of the 3 pillars of the church?
Yeah. I have this rational side of me thinking it's not possible ever to find every single name, especially for, some of these minority communities, right? So,
which is very true.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so you think, okay, what's the point in all of this? So I do think part of the point is there is something that I think we need in this generation of the church for whatever reason. And this is my political scientist. Maybe it's because we're in this highly advanced industrial capitalist society where connections to individuals and histories can sometimes just be lost and meaningless or made into some type of, commercialized product or something like that. Just stepping away from that and connecting with those histories, I think is a religious experience. It humbles you.
Yes.
It's like, who am I to be better than this ancestor that was born in the 1500s in the jungles of Southeast Asia that has no connection to the restored gospel? That is what I think the temple's about. And that's what it does for me religiously is it gives me this kind of humility that I can't ever explain how this is technically going to work, but that is the wonder of God's love and the atonement, is that you turn your hearts and that's enough for you, right? And for this generation. So I do also think it helps illustrate that the universality of the atonement that stretches back in time to all peoples and places. And
I feel that deeply. I can also witness to what you're saying.
Anyway.
That's beautiful. Oh, so Joel, you've had this incredible journey reconnecting to this Thai language. What advice would you have for anyone out there listening who wants to restore their ancestral languages, their family history languages as a way of encouragement?
I mean, I would just say to start. You don't have to look at those at the other end of this process or at natives and say, that's where I've got to get to start, right? I think part of the spirit of Elijah, since we've been talking about that, is just effort, is just to start in. I think that helps create the connection. So my sister recently has kind of asked me and said that she wants to start on this journey. And she's probably more typical of the average person out there, right? She's not going to have a ton of time to especially
She's not a professor.
Yeah. She's not going to go out
Even though she's wicked smart and amazing.
Yeah.
Celestia, I love you.
She's very smart. But it's not like she's going to make this part of her profession and merge it into that. So she's got to do this in her spare time. She's like, oh, I'm never going to be as good as you or this or that. I'm like, well, let's just start. Just start on the journey and do whatever you can do in your spare time. You don't always have to be a producer of this stuff. You can be a consumer of it and still benefit from it greatly. So you shouldn't feel any guilt about maybe you're not able to learn a language. Maybe that's just not your thing. But you can at least reach out to family members who may have done this or that and say, tell me, even if it's just a word, right? Like you said earlier on, what does your mother's name mean, right? I don't think my sister's ever actually even asked me that question. But I could answer her that question and say, hey, you should go read this Hindu epic poem, right, about Savitri. That would all take place in the English language, right? But there are things like that where you could say, okay, what does this word mean? And I'm sure there's a whole bunch of very basic things like, I love you, right? Or I love you, mum, right?
Oh my gosh, I love this.
And I think that would be very meaningful to her, right? To be able to say, I love you, mum, in Thai.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting here on the verge of getting very emotional about this because I do think that's like, we were never able to express that to our mum, right, growing up.
But you could say it to your kids.
Yeah, I could say it to my kids.
That I love you.
Yeah.
In that familial language. I Love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, Joel, if I can compose myself, because I'm feeling very emotional, grateful, excited for all the listeners out there that are feeling maybe empowered or excited to start this journey. Thank you so much for being here today. I know we were supposed to meet, and huge thanks to Celestia and making this happen. I'm just so grateful for you to be here.
Thank you for having me. It's been an amazing experience for me, because obviously you go through this, there's not very many people that are interested in hearing the ins and outs of all of these things.
Yeah.
And I'm sure my children have gotten tired of me just like geeking out about finding this little piece of information, but how much work went into finding like that little piece of information.
And building this connection and authenticity. I think when you have that your whole life, you don't understand how sorrowful, what a grieving, how emotional it is when you don't have it. And to give that as a gift to the next generations is huge. We talk a lot about in this podcast, transitional characters, that one person that changes the trajectory of the family history. And I can confidently say that you are a transitional character in your family. Your grandmother with her Singer sewing machine was a transitional character in her family. And that sort of confidence, bravery, creativity, optimism for the future, what else would be better to send to your descendants than that, and to your children? So I hope as adults, somehow your children find this and they listen to this and appreciate the beautiful gift you have given them. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Love Your Lineage. You can find all the references and full transcripts for this episode in our show notes at ldsliving.com/loveyourlineage. And if you have loved this episode, please leave us a review or a rating. This episode was hosted by me, Michelle. It was produced and edited by Erica Free and Katie Lambert, and mixed by Mix at 6 Studios. Thank you for being with us today, and we hope you feel empowered to love your lineage and embrace your authentic family history story.